Do you think you've been allowed to develop your own style at DC if you had gotten it there instead of Marvel?
That's an interesting question. I think well, I could say that when I started working at Marvel, I didn't think my work was good enough for Marvel.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Comics Cube. I am with the man who needs no introduction, Mr. Bill Sienkiewicz. Hi Bill, how are you doing today?
Hey, how are you? Good. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you too. My first question is, if I look into, articles about your early work, it vacillates between criticizing that you're a Neal Adams clone and then praising you for being more than a Neal Adams clone. So can you talk about the influence of Neal Adams on your work and how you grew out of that?
Well, Neal was a huge influence for me when I was growing up. At a certain point, when I was much younger and I was into the DC comics, because Marvel was sort of edgier, and at the age I started reading comics, like I'd go to the barber shop with my dad and there'd be like Westerns, and a lot of the comics would have the covers torn off them, and they'd be like these ancient relics. And of course there'd be some like Green Lantern or Batman and World's Finest or whatever. And so I got used to reading those. For some reason, even the barbers they wanted the most pablum kind of stuff. They wanted the most inoffensive stuff. And I think where I grew up, it's like the idea of actually having Marvel stuff. Even then, we're talking like back in the early 60s, where I think it's the first time I'm actually thinking about it. It's like I can recall going to several different barbers as a kid, and none of them had Marvel comics there. They always had these old Westerns or DC, but that's a separate thing. It's just an observation I'm aware of. But I grew up reading the DC stuff because it was safer. I mean, I love Kurt Swan stuff. Carmine Infantino's Flash. When Neal Adams started doing all the covers, that's when I so hated Neal's work. When I first saw it, it was like, what is and over the years, I've had people come up to me and say that when I first saw your work, I hated it, so I know exactly what these people are talking about. When they come to me later and say, I finally got it, it's like, I grew up a little bit, or to see what you were doing. But so at a certain point, that actually sparked me to give up. I hated it so much, I stopped reading DC comics and I switched to Marvel. It was like that extreme. I mean, I was in for a penny, in for a pound into comic books, and I remember like seeing Kirby stuff. For some reason, it was like it piqued my interest. So it was certainly a formative thing for me. But later on, I started to see some of Neal's interiors, and for some reason, it just grabbed me in a way that it hadn't before, and I became obsessed because I'd always drawn comics for my friends. I'd drawn comics for myself, with letter columns that I would write all letters, like for 3 people. And during the summer, I'd be lucky if there'd be like nobody around in the farm country I grew up in. But I was just enthralled and enmeshed in the entirety of comics, even the letter columns and all that stuff. So I sort of decided I wanted to be as good an artist as Neal. So it's like, I think, and there were no other artists, adults around who would say, you have to be yourself, because the whole idea of influences when you're a kid, because comics at that point were viewed as, disposable stuff for kids, like the general trope that we all are, we have all dealt with. I absolutely know for a fact, and my love for comics led me to say to my father when I was 7 that I was going to draw them as an adult. Love has stayed with me because as much as I was used to the sort of oh, comic books are just, it's like, they're not art. They're not, they're stupid. They're not literature. They're just disposable. It was insulting to me because I felt like, no, you don't get it. You don't get it. It's like, there's like, I learned how to read from comics, I mean, to a good part of it. I mean, I remember being in kindergarten, and there was a kid that he and I just did not get along at all. Yeah, he and I didn't see eye to eye at all. We had a real antipathy, but I called him out on it, and I called him my nemesis, So, and he was like, he looked at me like, like I'd sworn at him, and I said, well, like, let's settle this at lunch, like, or at recess, and, versus VS, in the Superman versus Lex, like I said, and I didn't know versus was a word. So I just knew VS. So I'm 5 years old. I'm going, you VS me at recess, and, but there were those kinds of experiences that comics sort of, got me into. Plus, a reader that didn't understand a word, I'd look it up, wanted to know more, and sort of, so that love for comics and the belief that as an art form has stayed with me ever since. And, I'll get back. I know I'm sort of digressing all over about the whole thing with Neal Adams, but I just wanted to draw as well as he could. I think I wanted to probably be like him. And so I really absorbed everything he did, even though during my whole childhood, I would gravitate to Neal. But since I love comics, there was a period when I think everyone in American comics, because again, where I grew up and the environments that I traveled in, which is really a very small area, and also being like in a pretty much a Polish area of immigrants in Pennsylvania, the idea of artistry beyond any of that, it was sort of very insular. And so I remember I think at one time or another in American comics, I was influenced by Sergio Aragonés when I got old enough to look at Mad Magazine.
Yeah.
Mort Drucker, Sal Buscema was another big one. Carmine Infantino was another big one. Even Kurt Swan. I mean, like for example, like this is going to sound like a minuscule example of what I loathe, the comfort, the denial of comfort food of Kurt Swan when Neal started doing the covers. If you think of Kurt Swan's Superman, whenever he would fly, he would do those vertical lines on Superman's boots when he was flying.
Yeah.
Remember, if you think back, and Neal would draw Superman's boots like on the covers without them, and it was like, and things were more angular and gutsy and everything else, or the rib cage, like the Klein or whoever, Tim or Murphy Anderson, the feathering on the rib cage would be very soft. Neal's stuff had a kind of an angularity to it and a severity to it that was just not working for me. Again, I came back to it later and it was like, this is the shit right here. The way he would draw emotions and everything else. So I threw myself into that and I just drew comics, but I tried to draw as well as Neal. Then when I saw his Tarzan paperbacks, that was, totally it. For Zeta, I just kept like a sponge, but it was all comic related stuff. And then when I went to art school right after graduating high school, that was when I started opening up to jazz music and film, illustration, fine art, the whole, like I realized I was actually more of an artist than I was a comic book guy. It's like I loved comics, but I also loved art. And to me, it was the idea of, I remember saying to, like when I was really into like guys like Bob Peak and Bernie Fuchs, who were the big illustrators during the time I was in art school. And I remember telling my friends that I said, I'd love to be able to do comics like as a combination of Bob Peak and Neal Adams, and it was just, that was just sort of like a goal for me, that I wanted to bring illustration style stuff into comics. So when I left art school, I had another year to go. My friends were all graduating because they were all a year ahead of me. And I thought, well, even though I'd become really familiar with fine art and studying design and composition, you know, different media, watercolor, I was just like in the thick of it. I knew I loved comics, so I thought, well, it was almost like the easiest thing to think of, like, well, maybe I'll try to see if I even have a shot. So I worked up a portfolio of 15 pages in about a month and went into DC comics because I didn't think my work was good enough for Marvel. And because I was trying to get into comics, I thought back to all of my years of being like influenced by Neal. And I said, well, there were a lot of Neal clones at the time. And, you know, there was like Mike Nasser, Mike Grell, guys who were sort of, and I looked at their stuff and I thought, I think I can at least reach the level of these guys, you know?
Yeah.
So in a way I was too naive to be scared, but I went in, which was quite a trip from the environs of northern New Jersey. You know, we're talking like going from Green Acres to, you know, Zsa Zsa Gabor's penthouse, you know. So they finally saw me. I just went in there without like I said, I had no appointment whatsoever. I just showed up with Coletta was the art director, and Coletta liked my, and he said, I could hire you, but you'll be out of work in like 2 weeks because we're getting rid of a lot of people. He says, I don't want that to happen to you. So he called Neal Adams. And I went to visit Neal at Continuity. And this is the first time I'd actually met. I think I'd met Neal at one New York convention, maybe 6 months earlier, where he had just done a panel. And I was like, I asked him a question or whatever. And, I don't know what the question was, but I just remember just being like starstruck, you know, and I don't remember if I got the words out. And then Neal looked at my stuff. Everybody in the studio stopped working and sort of gravitated around me. And it was this weird feeling of this, you know, I felt like Lil Abner, you know,
yeah.
standing around. Like I had, it was the height of you know, this like the 70s, late 70s, early 80s stuff, you know, pants you could play chess on, a big checkerboard, the Eiffel Tower tie, and a suit. I had a suit on, and Neal said, I like your stuff. And he called up Shooter, and I went over to Marvel, and I got hired by Marvel with a portfolio of nothing but DC characters, you know, and literally, I think I heard about this from my friend Elliot Brown. Like usually, I guess what they would do is they would have this thing that they would do with potential artists who would want to come in, and they would like ask one of the interns or whatever to kind of go out and look through the work, and because nobody really wanted to deal with the new artists coming in, you know. It's like, because usually, I guess apparently most of the stuff was direct, and so they sent Jim Owsley, who, you know, who's also known as Christopher Priest. He was yeah. So he looked at my stuff and he came back into Elliot and he said, he goes, because you're just going to come, they were going to shoot me down in flames. I think that their goal was to like have whoever's in that hot seat leave humiliated. And, you know, he said it was a little bit like Brody going, you're going to need a bigger boat. You know, when he said he walked back into Elliot, he said, this guy can actually draw. And I didn't know about that until maybe 5 years ago from Elliot, you know, and which is hilarious. You know, I thought, you sons of bitches. It's like, you know, you're holding like a young artist, like whole dream in your hands. And it's like, and it's so cavalier, you know, oh God, you know, it was like horrifying to think of that. So I did start off very much in the Neal Adams vein, even though I wrote my own stuff and colored my own stuff. Marvel wanted to slot me in as a penciler, and they started me off on Moon Knight. And they said, because I think they saw the Batman stuff and said, who of our characters can be a Batman sort of surrogate? And I think they came up with Moon Knight. And so, the idea of taking this crescent, the crescent cape and doing all that stuff.
Yeah.
So I kind of put my Neal Adams stamp on that. But Doug Moench, kind of walked me through a lot of the mechanisms of how to, tell stories and break down panels. And I realized that as I was working with Doug, I also realized that I like certain things, the bloom kind of goes off the rose where you start to feel like, okay, I'm not a full script guy. I like a lot more freedom. And so I started requesting plots instead. And I went through a slew of inkers until I wanted to start inking my own stuff. And I was always pushing to do more stuff. And, I had Rubenstein, great inker, Bob McLeod, Tom Palmer. I mean, that's some of the absolute best, to ink me, Klaus Janson. And finally, I said, I really just want to ink my own work. I said, I might not be the best inker, but I know what I want. And I think it was Alan Milgram said, let him ink his own stuff. He has as much right to screw up his work as anybody does. So I did. I started to ink my own work. And it was around that time when the readership with the responses, because there was much more of a lag than there is now. Things are so instantaneous now in terms of immediate. The responses that were coming in were this guy's a great, he's the best clone of them all, to he only learned to draw from Neal Adams, period. And that made me feel completely like my whole life had been for naught in a way. I felt invisible, and I also thought, well, nobody told me that, about being myself. Even though I had all of this stuff in my sketchbook and all this art that I was absorbing from art school, I wanted to put into comic because for me, comics should handle anything. And I thought if I could pull in Robert Rauschenberg style stuff, or I could pull in, photography, some of what like Steranko did, some of it, even Kirby did some of that kind of stuff. But I thought multimedia would be kind of cool to try in comics and really, Andy Warhol, whatever. And because of the negative feedback I started getting, I thought I'm either going to do my own thing or I'm going to get out. So I kind of drew a line in the sand for myself and said, I'm going to dive in to do my own work. And that's when the later issues of Moon Knight with Morpheus and Black Spectre, and then Hit It which was my plot. Because I started to realize that I was also starting to feel like I wanted to try musical aspects or playing with the form as opposed to the villain of the month, I wanted like the whole idea of hit it and a beat and having the story have like a recurring stanza or recurring phrase. I realized that was when I did that issue, I sort of felt like, okay, I think I've done everything I want with this character. And I stayed for like a few more issues, said I'm not going to do any more series for a while. I just want to do painted covers. And that's when I was doing Dazzler. And it wasn't until Chris Claremont, I turned down the X-Men. And it wasn't until Chris Claremont came to me and asked me if I wanted to do a 3-issue story with the Demon Bear, that I went, okay, I think I can do that. Because that was abstract enough for me to run with. I know it's a long answer, but that's really, kind of like I went from, I wanted to be like Neal to wanted to be like not Neal, but Neal was still in the mix. And so I would actively do things that were like, if I had a solution in mind that would be like, would Neal do something like this? And I'd go the other way,
That's
and yeah. So, but now it's like, it's part of who I am. It's like, I still find it comes to me every now and then. It's like certain, the hands or playing with anatomy or foreshortening or certain things. But I couldn't have picked a better role model in terms of just sheer draftsmanship ability to sort of begin with. But we all start with our influences and then hopefully grow from there, you know.
I'm surprised, knowing what I know of your art and the style that you have, that a lot of your early influences were people like Kurt Swan and Carmine Infantino. It's just not how I view your artwork, and so that's a little surprising to me. Plus, also you speak of Neal Adams the way a lot of younger fans and artists speak of Jack Kirby. Like I didn't get it at first, and now I do.
Yeah, I seem to get Kirby, like Kirby was Marvel to me. When I saw Kirby's stuff, his stuff was so ubiquitous to Marvel. I mean, and you could always tell. I mean, at certain points, sometimes a lot of I'm trying to recall of some of the comics that I read, like the collections of stories. I didn't know a lot of the artists' names. I mean, I Kirby, for somebody like, you'd have one guy on Thor and it wasn't Jack Kirby, and it would just look kind of off to me, you know? But yet all of these different styles, like, and different artists and different levels of ability, you know, some really jumped out at you. Some of them were more pedestrian in terms of the impact. But to me, the medium, especially like in newspaper strips, everything from Peanuts to Gandhi to Dick Tracy to Steve, Steve Canyon, to all like, you could have stuff in comic strips that were very silly, gag cartoons, and then very serious like war stuff or crime detective stuff, or say stuff like Leonard Starr's Mary Perkins on Stage, which was like a romance strip. And I thought, wow, this medium can handle anything. It's like, that was what was so like thrilling to me. Superheroes just that was just sort of at the time, that was the next logical step for me. And then of course Mad Magazine, which was another whole level up. Yeah. But yeah, Kirby was definitely the guy for Marvel. He and Romita,
John Romita. Okay. There is an alternate universe somewhere where Vince Coletta gives you the job at DC, and DC at the time is known for they're very protective about their characters. They redo Kirby's faces on Superman and everything. Do you think you've been allowed to develop your own style at DC if you had gotten it there instead of Marvel?
That's an interesting question. I think I could say that when I started working at Marvel, I didn't think my work was good enough for Marvel. So because you didn't see like Grell doing stuff at Marvel, it was like or a lot of the quote clones, Mm-hmm. So I think I was kind of playing it safe. But then when I got accepted into Marvel, and the editors that I worked with, from Ralph Macchio, Rick Marshall to eventually Ann Nocenti, there was an irreverence that really fit with my sensibilities. It was a really Marvel in the bullpen during the time that I was there early on, had a real playful, hey, we're all making comics. I think DC was a lot more corporate, and I think it's still to some extent is. I mean, I've actually run into more things where projects have been killed. I mean, over the years. Now, I'm not saying back at that period of time, because obviously I didn't start doing work for them until I started doing a couple of painted covers, and then I did the Shadow. And even with the Shadow, once I signed the contracts, I was led to believe it was right after Elektra. I was led to believe that it was going to be the next like step up, because I wanted to take everything that I worked on, every project. Like for me, Moon Knight was me playing in the realm of familiar, Neal Adams, and then sort of stretching into my own style. The New Mutants was another step up in terms of abstraction, and then doing painted covers. Elektra Assassin and the Kingpin graphic novel, Love and War, was me working with Frank and, and finding a real collaborator and really pushing the painted interior stuff. And then straight toasters were all mine, just like everything. It was, so I always felt that I didn't want to kind of slip back. I kept feeling like I just wanted to keep pushing the envelope. And when I agreed to do the question, I'm sorry, not the question, the shadow. Once I signed the contract, they said, "Oh, by the way, it's like no, we're not paint. You can paint the covers, but the interiors have to be adhere to what Chaykin had established." Yeah, I think, and I kind of felt like a little bit of a under false pretenses, like a bait and switch at the time, because once I signed the contract, that was when I was told, you're not going to do anything like Electros. It has to be, it's got to be based on what Chaykin had done, and I love his work, but I always felt like I didn't want to have to follow anybody's style. Even when I did the New Mutants, I love McLeod's work, but I was the wrong guy to follow him and to do what he had established. Whether I'm just, I try to play well with others, or whether I just feel like I have my own idea of what I want to see in a book or a series, it's just my way. And it's not something I do deliberately to try to upset anybody. It's just, I see things a certain way, and that's how I want them to come across. So what I ended up doing was I took the shadow and I kind of turned it into like an academic exercise. I was just practicing with the inks. I was looking at like Henry Pitts. I was looking at Frazetta, Topi, Franklin Booth, and I just tried to turn it into an inking exercise, so that there was always, if I couldn't push the envelope, I would at least go back to school in terms of if I had to tell something in a certain way, so it was an okay experience. I mean, a lot of people seem to really like what I did on the shadow, but for what I had hoped it could be, I think my experience with DC at the time was that I became really aware of the corporate like mindset of this is kind of the constrictions, the restrictions. Whereas when I was going to do several issues of the Daredevil comic with Frank, and that's when I really started to push that Kingpin, that big hulking sort of cartoon version of Kingpin, that was going to be in the regular comic. And Shooter saw it and called me into his office and said, "Hey, this is going to be in the regular issue. It's going to screw up continuity." But he said, "Do it as a graphic novel." So that's the difference. It's like Marvel may have said, "You can't do this, but you can't do this here, but you can do it here." With Marvel, with DC, it felt like you just can't do it. It's like, it's just, that's not what we're doing here. So I think the way it worked out for me, and it's kind of like odd thinking about it, because that again is a really good question. I think, and I've worked with Marvel and DC and all the companies, and I love everybody there. I just realized that in terms of my creativity and my pushing things, I think a lot of my youthful exuberance and I'm either going to do this my way or I'm going to get out. I think the likelihood that I might have gotten out would have probably been increased if I had actually started working at DC first. I'm only speculating, but it feels like it's headed more in that direction. So the way things worked out couldn't have been more optimum.
In that alternate universe, I think about how they correct Kirby's faces, and I'm just wondering how they would correct yours. That would just be impossible.
Well, that's which is funny because how things go is like it's like the new wave becomes the old guard. It's like I grew up worshiping Jim Aparo, and later on I started doing a bunch of finishes over Jim's work. on some of his later issues. And this is, I think, I don't know how old Jim was. I never met him in person. We did have a long conversation one time, several hour conversation, where I got to tell him how much I loved his stuff, and we talked about everything. And at the end of the conversation, he said, I have one favor to ask, because however old he was, there was a certain point when his work and Neal's had a very similar kind of dynamic, if like in terms of, even though Jim did all of his own inking, he did all of his own lettering, there was something that, the way he would do Batman felt very mysterious, and his later work started to get a little blockier and would lose some of the fluidity. And I think when the editors approached me to do finishes, they said, can you fix some of his drawing and fix some of his faces? And at the end of that conversation, and that was the premise under which the auspices of that mandate, like to go in and like sort of just play with this stuff a little bit more, to sort of bring it into whatever was viewed as saleable at the time, because I think that there's a tendency for a lot of older artists to kind of get shunted aside for the new flavor. And I loved working with Aparo. I loved working with, with Infantino. I became friends with Nick Hardy, and he was a dear friend, and I would have loved to have inked him on some projects, but to actually get them to actually try to hire Nick to do something, it was fruitless, So they were giving work to Jim though. And then at the end of the conversation, he said, can you stop basically fucking with my faces? He goes, I have a favor to ask of you. And he said it in kind of a joking way. And I'm drawing on that one. And I went, you got it. I said, I didn't sort of throw any editor under the bus or anything. I was saying, like, I was told to redraw stuff. But I went to the editors and I said, look, I out of absolute respect for Jim, I'm just going to ink what he gives me. And it was not too long after that they basically stopped giving him work, and I don't know how long after that he passed away. And I'm not saying that any of those things are linked, it's like one was a causation or correlation does not necessarily mean causation. But the fact is that, it was a whole, again, a lot of the jobs sort of become a microcosm of the business, of how things sort of operate. Like when I inked Sal Buscema on the Spider-Man, they actually approached me and they said, can you ink it like Scott Williams? And I said, you really got the wrong guy. And I remember I decided that I would just go really graphic and meaty with the stuff that I did over Sal. And Sal loved it because he actually came up to me back when, like, during the conventions, when they actually had conventions and physical contact was, like, he got up out of his behind his table and he came up and give me a big hug. He goes, I love what you did. And I was like, you were like such a major influence. So it was, same thing with Joe Sinnott. I mean, it's like, Sinnott was like the guy who taught me so much about drawing and simplifying things because I knew it was going to be in his hands. So I started to learn about just composition and telling a story. I didn't worry about whether everything was rendered right because I knew that there was anything I put down was going to be interpreted or redrawn by the inker. So, I have a serious reverence and respect for anybody who can do this as a life, a vocation, but especially like, people who I grew up reading, they're all masters. Anybody who does this for a living it's an unusual calling. Let's put it that way.
I was collecting the Spider Clone saga at the time, and at the time I thought Sal Buscema's art in the 90s needed an edge, and then all of a sudden you were inking him, and I was like, wait, what just happened? Because this is so different from everything I've seen Sal Buscema draw.
Yeah, and it was a real jump for me too, because I had I mean, again, as somebody who saw his stuff and read his stuff with, I forget who inked him. I know he did a lot of inking over his brother, but I'm trying to remember, was it Giacoya? Or I don't remember who inked Sal on a lot of the, like the Cap stories that he did and everything. There was a certain cleanliness to his style. It was like, it was very direct, you know? And which I because I would vacillate between sort of the intricacies of Neal's like anatomy, and then I would bounce over to like, you know, like a palate cleanser. I just needed like, just give me comics, you know, and just like, and so because it was ping pong for me, bouncing everywhere. So when I did it, I was trying to think of how to approach his work, and for some reason, because of his breakdowns, I just started thinking in terms of like I almost like, not necessarily Alex Toth, but I thought I've never really seen his work inked with like a heavy light source, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And like I decided, you know, with a certain kind of meat, and it felt more like I was trying more of a European flavor, you know. And again, whether that was conscious or not, I don't know. All I know is that it felt right. It felt like a real unleashing of like, I don't know if I would have done that if I'd been on any other inker, any other penciler at the time, you know. So I mean, I still look back at some of those and I go, wow. I mean, I look at the question of how I got away with so many of the things I did. That one is one I don't know how I got away with to this day, inking over Sal. But yeah. that to me will remain a kind of question.
I'm gonna go back to Moon Knight. You and Doug Moench really put Moon Knight on the map. You know how many artists would be lucky to say that Doug Moench was the most celebrated writer they've ever worked with? And I was looking at your bibliography, and I think Doug Moench, if I was to go by the number of, you know, awards people have won, I think he's number 5 on your list.
Yeah. He was like, I love Doug. I mean, I visited him a number of times in Pennsylvania, him, Deb, and I sort of feel like, you know, over the years, he sort of feels like, yeah, I think he feels like I sort of like, we had our thing, and then we kind of like, I kind of moved away, and like, it's like, and I think he's wanted to try to do something again, which it would be fun to work with Doug again. I think he got the kind of thankless, unenviable position of taking a newbie and trying to like show him the ropes, you know, and so I think it would be interesting to sort of revisit something with Doug again, because I remember reading not only his stuff in comics, but also a lot of the Warren stuff. He was big writer for a lot of the creepy, eerie Vampirella stuff, and also I also remember reading some of his articles in a bunch of magazines and stuff as well. So he's a huge influence on me, and I always think I end up feeling kind of bad that he kind of got the really, you know, the rough version of me, that sort of, you know, and I think he showed me the ropes, and he took a lot of heat, I think, for the things I was trying to do, because I know that he didn't always see eye to eye with the editors, or certainly not with Shooter. I mean, it was no secret. So like when Moon Knight became its own comic, its own direct sales, Shooter, I drew the entire first issue, and then Shooter had me redraw it completely, because he wanted me to, like, he had it set that he had it a certain way that it wanted to look. And it was like he was trying to get me to like de-escalate some of my figures going outside of panels, like the Neal Adams, some of the more experimental kind of stuff. So I was becoming more narrative. So that, you know, there's always that push and pull between dealing with the marketplace and then dealing with the editors. But you know, with certainly the editors were a big factor in allowing me to try to push stuff. But Doug, like you say, Doug is just, he's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant.
Feel like he's a writer that was much bigger at the time that he's made out to be now, and I think that's unfortunate.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I really, it's like that's the interesting thing about this business and about life in general. I mean, sort of just on a very tangential note, like I would collect old other reference sources. When I was in Westport, a lot of the illustrators used to have a clip file. When they would pass away, they would donate it to the Westport Library. And there were a lot of illustrators in Westport. So like Albert Dorn or Robert Fawcett, their photo morgue would become, was just this one big room in the Westport Library we could go in, and it was just, cars, different like lighting fixtures and things that you couldn't, there was no internet then. So you couldn't just look up, all right, what do lamps, street lamps look like in London? Yeah. It's like you have to go and try to find it. And so a lot of the, like, I would see these Life magazines and I would collect them. And like on the covers of like Life magazine, which was one of the biggest magazines at the time, like in the 50s, because I had some older issues, these splits, or these actors or articles, and it's like these were the hottest young ingenues or hottest young, like, trendsetters or whatever, and they are completely lost to history. It's like you've never heard of them, and yet at one point they were famous enough to be on the front page or front cover of and I've said this to other artists that, I remember talking to George Pratt. It's like we're we all know the ones that we love and the really well-known ones. It's like people assuming science, what it's like, they kind of go to the big ones. But then we just remarked that there are so many brilliant talents out there who are kind of just, they're there if you want to look for them, but, or stumble upon them and sort of claim them as your own. But, for Zeta, there was there's another person, brilliant in their own way that nobody ever heard of. There are some people now who don't even really know who Jack Kirby is, in terms of some of the readership, it's sort of, or else they don't know the lineage, the history. It's like, people asking, Neal if he was influenced by me, when it's, it's like, well, I'm sorry, let's flip that, So the point is that it's always going to be that way. The point is, and the other thing is just do what you can during the time that you have and just tell the stories the best that you can. And hopefully leave some kind of legacy. If any of the work is going to survive the creators who do it, then why not go all out? I don't see any reason why not to push it.
Adams has this one anecdote on his Facebook where apparently some fan asked him if he was influenced by J. Scott Campbell.
Right. Yes. He's told me that story. Yeah, exactly. And we all, I think anybody who's sort of in the business, I would get that a lot with Bisley and McKean, or David Mack, it's like, and it's, I view all of their work as, it's just, I love all of their work, but, I know what I try to do and where I fit in sort of the pecking order, and that, like, Neal influenced a whole slew of us, as well. Kirby, there are people who are still doing Kirby. It's like, and it's kind of great to keep that history going, It's, but at the same time, I find that there are a lot of artists who do much more unique, more indie kind of work. And I find that sometimes is more intriguing to me now than, say, something that is very popular in a kind of a mainstream way. I think I tend to be a little bit more. I guess I always felt I was more like David Lynch than Steven Spielberg. You know,
Yeah.
myself personally. You know, that's just how I'm wired. And the fact that the work is, you know, that people know my work simply from, I guess, some of it may be longevity, some of it may just simply be that I happen to be at the right place at the right time for certain things. Or maybe because I also jumped around a lot. You know, I was like, I didn't want to be pigeonholed. So, you know, that to me is just, again, timing is everything sometimes.
The first time I ever saw your work was the trade paperback for the Dark Phoenix Saga.
Oh, okay, with the cover?
The cover for that, yeah. As much as I love John Byrne, because John Byrne is the first artist I ever recognized the name of, but as much as I love John Byrne, I was wondering where I could find more of that art that was on the cover.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah,
I don't think you were credited, and I was like, I have no idea who this is, and the internet wasn't around.
Yeah, exactly. I think at that point, I mean, I always hated my last name and having to write it out, because I felt like I didn't have a cool signature like Neal Adams, or you know, or that little like colophon that Jeff Jones with the J, or Frazetta with, you know, the swirlies, the curves over his F and the T's and stuff. So I went through so many different ways of signing my name. I think on that one, I think it was a BS in a box, but I played around with it. Now it's just, it looks like a doctor's prescription for something, you know.
Speaking of the X-Men, so talk about New Mutants.